if it wasn't for Florida and Texas, we might not have ever reopened our economy, right? But the fact that that Florida and Texas reopened and people functioned became the incentive or the air cover for New York and California to reopen. So if you're an individual, the solution is you run to the place with the least government, figure out where that is, and you run away from the place with the most government, because the most authoritarian government is probably going to choke you to death. Entrepreneur, you're an investor, you have to have a 10-year time horizon. And nothing great is accomplished without a decade. If you look at Microsoft, the company's founded in the mid-70s, a decade later in their mid-80s. If you're not willing to hold Microsoft stock for a decade, you probably didn't get to the point where they came public. So a decade's a short period of time for someone who's an industrialist or an investor. I mean, Warren Buffett still owns Coca-Cola stock, and he must have bought it 50 years ago, right? So I think that anybody that's a billionaire, right? All of these names, the Sergey Brins, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musks of the world, they didn't get there without holding an asset that had technical potential for a decade or longer. There's no get rich quick scheme. So I think that people want an easy route. If you're trying to get a quick win with no volatility, with no risk, doesn't make sense. And if you're actually trying to be successful in a hurry with volatility, that probably still won't work either. I mean, ultimately, success comes from taking a decade-long view, right? Andrew Mellon, John D. Rockefeller, Jeff Bezos, right? We forget, like, Tesla was founded 20 years ago. People think it's an overnight success, but it's not an overnight success. And with regard to the macro picture, we live in a time of unprecedented public intervention in the affairs of the economy, right? Unprecedented. We never in the history of the country did you have a government that told you couldn't have Thanksgiving dinner with your family because they didn't want family members to sit too close to each other. Yeah. We arrested a dude on a surfboard in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for basically paddle boarding in the middle of the Pacific because that was deemed as unsafe, right? That kind of stuff. So we have an unprecedented amount of encroachment. We have politicians overriding the free market. They tell you what kind of energy you can use. They tell you, how far you have to sit from someone. They tell you whether it's safe to be sitting in your office at a table next to someone. Lots and lots of encroachment. Each of these areas, right? War is the suppression of the free market to the benefit of the public or the public organization, right? The government is suppressing the free market. So if the government keeps suppressing the free market everywhere, what you do is you cripple production, right? Yeah, that's what we have tariffs on Chinese imports, right? That drive up prices up or down, drives them up, right? You have a war or a labor war, right? If everybody unionizes and if everybody's afraid to go to work, and if everybody thinks that their life is threatened to stand next to another human being, right? And if we're afraid to trade with each other, and if we're afraid to talk with each other, right? If you have capital controls, wage controls, price controls, export controls, manufacturing controls, right? As those things happen, they have a chilling effect on the economy. So what we have right now is, on one hand, you have a supply side problem, right? We're not producing as much. The degree of not producing, by the way, is misunderstood. The currency weakened by 20% in the year after COVID. If the economy measured in nominal terms is flat, that meant that the overall economic output decreased by 20%. The overall economic output decreased by 20% or more in the last 2 years. People wonder if we're in a recession. We've been in recession since March of 2020. But what we have is a situation where all the metrics are distorted, right? For example, how many people would measure the economy based upon GDP output measured in dollars? most. Is that the correct measure? No, right? Because the dollar is not worth what it was 24 months ago, right? What
So
if
how would you look at it?
You have to measure it in real terms or measure it in the actual output of goods and services. For example, how many airline miles got flown, right? If Emirates Airlines grounded half their fleet and decommissioned it after COVID, now they're up and running the part they didn't decommission. How is it possible that the air sector could possibly recover to the point where it was in January of 2020? If you've actually mothballed or decommissioned half the airplanes, right? I could double the price of a ticket. If I double the price of a ticket, I can tell you that the size of the airline industry is the same as it was in January 2020, right? I could declare there's no recession. But the fact is, everything costs twice as much. There's half as much of it, right? I changed the way that I measured it. GDP measured in nominal terms is a gross distortion, and then CPI is a gross distortion. If I have 100 things that you want, and I pick 10 of them, and I measure the increase in the price of 10, and I ignore the price in the other 90, I can show you a CPI is 8%, right? 8.3% is the number this morning. But the actual inflation rate is higher, but it's inflation on something, like it's inflation on something you want, but I'm not going to choose to measure. For example, the 30-year bond is traded up to 350 basis points, and it was 180, right? Mortgages have doubled. So mortgages have doubled, housing prices are up 35%. And that means in theory, the cost for you to actually buy a home is going to be 50, 60% higher year over year. But I don't choose to measure it because we don't actually calculate CPI that way. I take a survey and I ask you whether or not you think you could raise your rent by something. And if the owner equivalent rent is up 3%, then I say that the inflation is 3 or 5. So we have a set of metrics that are just manufactured metrics. And then we focus on them and then we talk about them. But ultimately, what you have is an economy that's distorted. There are some things we produce more of, and there are some things we produce less of. And we have flexibility with what we choose to measure. The monetary intervention is the government basically, if I put everybody under home arrest for a year, it's going to be a problem for the economy, right? I mean, if I shut down, they did it in New Zealand, they did it in Australia, they did it in Canada, they kind of did it in certain states in the US. If I do that, that cripples the economy. So while I'm doing that, then if I go ahead and I pump a lot of money in the system, right, then maybe I create a wealth effect and I can say, well, we're recovering. But ultimately, you never recover from the fact that nobody went to school for a year and nobody, went to work for a year, right? You can't, you've lost that forever. You're just not measuring it. You can change your metrics, right? There's a saying, you write the winners write the history books. So the Romans remember the Carthaginians as being like evil, right? If we win the war, then we write out all of the good that our adversary did, and we write up all the good that we did, and we suppress all the bad that we did because we won the war. We write the history books, and so I think right now what you see in the economy is lots of distortion of numbers, lots of distortion of metrics. Right. The fact that we have a debate over whether we are in a recession or not is kind of laughable, right? Because we've been in a recession for 24 months. If you were measuring the production of goods and services, all you got to do is look at the variety of things that were available to you in January of 2020 versus the variety of things available to you today and the delays. If you've got 1/10 the selection and it takes 3 times as long to get it and it costs 20% more, how are you not in a recession?